Hello everyone, it's great to be back. And I just realized you're home when your Wi-Fi connects automatically, and it did. So for me it's really great to be back here on stage. And I will talk about some things you probably know or maybe not know about Spring Boot, which sometimes actually feels a little bit magical. And you will just realize that some things, maybe even going deeper, it's just the things you're using throughout the days at work. So just maybe some few words about me. So it's Patrick. I'm actually in the Spring ecosystem for quite a while. I'm teaching Spring since 2011, and maybe if you have taken the Spring certification, I might be guilty because I was contributing to the questions as well. So if you want to have, or if you want to provide feedback, just talk after that with me, of course. So yeah, just realizing, getting a little bit nervous here. I'm from Switzerland. I do quite a lot of things working with software teams. I'm an engineer. I like to build beautiful solutions with human beings. And Spring Boot is actually for a long time my tool actually I use all the time. And besides that, I'm also a bit involved in the software community. And I just recently got a Java champion, which is actually insane. So yeah. But anyhow, we just dive into the topic, and I think I will tell you right now what we're not going to do, right? Because this talk is not about inversion of control. It's not about Spring Beans per se. It's not about configuration styles. It's not about bean lifecycle. It's not about some magic things about Spring AOP or even composed annotations. So there are quite a few other things I want to talk about in this presentation. And if you have seen the abstract, you probably learned that we are going to talk about starters AutoConfiguration and things actually Spring Boot provides you from the perspective of convention over configuration. And in the end, I hope we have still time actually to go through, and I can show you how you could even do your custom starter. Because sometimes in an enterprise environment, it definitely makes sense actually to build your own starters to simplify the work for maybe your colleagues, or to standardize certain ways. So let's dive actually into the topic. And I first want to tell you something about what's magic and what's boilerplate, because I think it's actually quite important, because I do not believe that Spring Boot is magic for me anymore, right? But maybe when you came here, you said Spring Boot does certain things. I don't know exactly what it does, and I would love to demystify that for you. And of course, we are also talking a little bit about boilerplate as well. So what actually means magic for us as a developer? Of course, actually we know that we run an application, and you look at the source code, and from the look at the source code, you do not realize what the application does in production. Well, I'm glad we are not Python developers, right? But with Java, it's a little bit easier to do that. Sometimes, if you and your colleagues wrote some code, maybe you violated some patterns. Certain things look strange, and you violated maybe the single responsibility principle, or maybe you also violated the command query separation very often. And just because you did the naming wrong, things look strange. Sometimes you don't know what to expect, and that means also it feels like magic, right? And you could actually say that there is a thin line between magic and actually understanding code. And if you would ask me what I would say what really magic is, I would tell you that it's probably the surprise factor. If code is surprising me, then actually it's magic, right? So that's actually my very simple definition for this. So if you talk about boilerplate, it's something we try to avoid, of course. And actually if you write repetitive code, it definitely feels like boilerplate, and you want to get rid of that. And frameworks often do this for us, right? So the application, even within the same code base, is actually a bad sign. And of course, writing boilerplate code, it's not interesting, but it's often necessary. And if you think of these days coding with AI, you just generate quite a lot of boilerplate code, and you have so much duplication in your code base, right? So yes, so as a good engineer, you would know how to fix this. So the question is like, is it magic or is it boilerplate? And sometimes it's quite a subjective term. And I don't think that like neither is bad, because sometimes you really need to duplicate code to understand like what it does, so you can extract some logic. And in the end, it's about context and trade-offs, right? And boilerplate is not something which is like magic. It's not even the opposite of magic, right? So it's like something quite different. As I said, it's more like the surprise factor of like what you see and what or how the application behaves in production. So a good friend of mine, David Tanzer, said like a while ago that boilerplate is mostly a problem when writing code. Magic when reading and debugging. We read more, or we read and debug more than we write code, right? So it's really like depending in which situation you are, when you read code, when you debug code, and so on. So sometimes it feels like boilerplate, of course. Sometimes it feels more like magic. And of course, actually, like, magic might become knowledge. And you know that if you get introduced in a magic trick, if somebody tells you how a magic trick works, it doesn't feel magical anymore, right? So you just know the technique, and it's quite fine. So what I would say, like, from a developer perspective is, it's too much magic until you read the documentations, maybe several books, and the source code, and then magic becomes knowledge. So if you know more about it, of course, the surprise factor is less, right? And that's actually like what we want to focus on in this presentation. So jumping into Spring Boot directly and showing you a few things which might look from the outside a little bit magical. So you know that Spring Boot has a very strong opinionated way. And we have the luck that actually, like, the creators of Spring Boot said that Spring Boot is production ready. So if you want to have things working for development, you really have to like turn on some or turn off some caching. You really have to turn on additional logging. And the thing is, what you're building from scratch by default is meant for production, which also like reduces the risk in production. Then of course, like in the previous years, or maybe like when you think of like when Spring and Framework started and then when Spring Boot came into place, the problem was just like we had to like repetitively configure like the Spring Beans. And Spring Boot actually like brought in this approach of convention over configuration, which many other frameworks did. And of course, actually, like, you know that you need to configure basically like the exceptions or like the special cases. Spring Boot also like is a huge thing when you think of like setting up a project. Before, maybe it took like days, and now it's like very fast, and you can just like bootstrap an application within minutes. And I would even say like creating a RESTful service end-to-end to the database, it takes me maybe like 10 minutes if I know how to do things. And probably I can even do it faster, I guess, with all the things which follow this convention over configuration. So that's actually a great thing which makes us more productive, and I think that's also very important as a developer, that we can move fast. So basically, where is the snake oil in the whole thing? Where is like the magic happen, or like the really nice and tiny bits which make us more productive? And let's talk about the first thing you definitely have seen already, but I think it's actually like very important to highlight. It's Spring Boot dependency management, because you know that you can basically like use the Spring Boot dependency management, and you have these monthly updates of Spring Boot, and you're just like on top with all the frameworks. Like the vulnerabilities get fixed like every month. You just like need to put your application into production, and that's basically it. So with Maven, it's quite simple actually, like just by pulling in a parent, which then inherits like the definition for the dependencies or the versioning of the dependencies. That's like one thing. Another thing which is quite important is it configures also like Maven plugins. Think of like the way you would actually like compile your Java application with Maven. I usually forget to add the minus params parameter, so that actually like certain things like detection of method parameters get recognized. Because otherwise you would have to use, like in Spring Data JPA, something like add param, right? And this just like is automatically added, and we don't see it as a developer. We don't need to remember these traps all the time. It's just there, and it's pre-configured through Maven in Spring Boot. So that helps quite a lot. And then, of course, also like there is an easy way to configure compiler via the Java version, and just like things work out of the box because somebody else did it for us. Of course, when you talk about the dependency management with the starters, you will automatically get all the transitive dependencies which are needed. And of course, the Spring team is quite opinionated on things. So if you think of this, that you want to use, for example, the Spring Boot starter web, you get automatically like checksum pulled in because the Spring Boot team thinks that you're using RESTful services anyway, and you need checksum for doing the JSON marshalling, right? And what I find quite interesting as well is by pulling in this dependency, you get a Tomcat, right? And you just can start the application out of the box, and it's like by default configured. It's kind of magic what happens behind the scenes, and I don't need to care about it. So this is actually like quite nice. And if you want to like adjust certain things, you could think of like just like changing some properties in Maven to say like, I want to use a predefined version and I want to pin it because I need that, right? Sometimes you have to do it, and usually like at work, I need to do it for things like maybe like Flyway or the database or other things. Sometimes you want to upgrade because a vulnerability popped up and you want to fix it like earlier because you cannot wait for the next Spring Boot release. So you have like all these possibilities actually like to work with that. The same actually like works with Gradle as well. The approach is slightly different. There is just like this dependency management plugin which does the magic for you, which allows you to not define version numbers. And if you want to override them, as you can see like in the last line, there is also like a very nice and easy way to basically like change a certain dependency. So that maybe feels like magic sometimes, and I'm really glad. I cannot express my feelings for that, because it's so much work if you would have to maintain all these versions on your own, making sure that all the dependencies work together, and I'm super glad the Spring Boot team does that for me as well, right? So I do not need to care like what works with what, and usually in my applications there is maybe like 5 to 10 dependencies I have to manage myself, and everything else I get actually like through the Spring Boot dependencies, which is actually like awesome. Okay. But now let's have a look on something you always see if you look at the application class in Spring Boot, where you see like the Spring Boot application annotation, which is basically like the starting point for your Spring Boot app, and it's also kind of like feeling magic. So if you look at this annotation actually, there is some hidden features, of course, in there. And you can imagine this Spring Boot application annotation is nothing than a composed annotation. So if you would like dig into the source code, you would actually see that it's shorthand for Spring Boot configuration, @enable AutoConfiguration, and component scan at the same time. So that means just like basically this annotation is the thing which enables AutoConfiguration by default, right? And it's just hidden inside a composed annotation. And also what you can see here is that component scanning is automatically enabled, as you probably know, of course. And basically like the annotation itself would also have some parameters you can use for configuration purposes, and that's just like also a short way how to do this. Now the thing actually like when you're maybe like starting with Spring Boot, you might think of like the structure you get generated from start Spring IO is like maybe a little bit strange, and you want to maybe change the packages, and then you actually realize, oh, certain things do not work like expected. So, and when I was actually like using Spring Boot like the first time, I thought I'm smarter, I want to have a different structure, and then I definitely like fall into that trap. And Spring Boot assumes certain default conditions actually. So that means basically like when you have your main application class, then actually like it's scanning downwards all the sub-packages for component scanning, for entity scanning, for the JPA repository scanning, and so on and so forth. So if you follow the structure, you basically have the application class on the top level, and everything below will be automatically discovered. If you have the idea to put your application class into a launcher package, and everything else is maybe like on the same level, you are into real trouble, actually. So that means like you have to configure everything manually, just because you did not know, right? So that's definitely a thing to be aware of, that just because of structure and this opinionated approach, things get automatically detected. And it makes life so much easier if you just follow the typical Spring Boot guidelines. Having a look a little bit deeper into auto-configuration, it's actually there where the magic actually happens. And auto-configuration is something which is done for you, and also like which is quite opinionated, I would say. So if you look at the auto-configuration annotation itself, so that means like you look at the source code and you just do, you will actually like realize that the auto-configuration class is nothing else than just a regular configuration class. Because of performance reasons, it has proxy bean methods disabled. So that means actually like there is no proxy created for these specific classes, and that means actually like startup is faster. For your configuration classes, it does not matter much. But if you have like in Spring Boot like 80 or 100 auto-configuration classes which are considered during startup, it makes a huge difference. But maybe for your 5 or maybe 7 configuration classes you have, it really does not matter much, right? There is also like a feature which is called like auto-configure before and after, which just helps you basically like to tell when the auto-configuration should run. And I will just talk about that in a minute. So the before and the after is actually like an important thing if you want to make sure that the auto configurations are run in a specific order. So that's actually like a very important thing if you write your own starter, if something like this is needed. And let's assume you want to have like the data source auto configuration running, which is basically providing you the data source. And then you have the Spring Boot starter for JDBC in there, which creates the JDBC template. And we know the JDBC template needs a data source to be configured on and even to be created. So that means like we are depending on the data source auto configuration. And then if you go either a step further, you could even say like generating Spring data repositories would be then the next step, of course. And that means like we need to have a certain order. And you can easily configure that, and also that's what the Spring Boot team is doing for us. They just like use this or make use of this auto-configure before and after annotation to make explicitly the thing in that way that we have a certain order which is mandatory, because otherwise the configuration might not work anymore. So that helps us to bring structure into auto-configuration. And that means, of course, if I'm going to write my own starter, for example, I can leverage this feature as well. To make sure that actually like the auto configuration gets registered, there is a specific file which has quite a long name, and I just call it here AutoConfiguration.imports, because like otherwise it would be a tongue twister for me, I would say, right? But you see it on the slides. And this list, this file, contains like all of the auto-configuration classes which are in the Spring Boot auto-configure jar file. Fun fact here, in this jar file, in this Spring Boot auto-configure jar, is basically like the main things which are part of the Spring Boot release trains. And as you can see, there is like data source involved, mail configuration. There is maybe even like some other things in there which you might not use yet because you did not have added the dependency to your application. That's fine, but if you're part of this release train, your configuration is just like within this single jar. If we are going to write our own configuration, and certain frameworks like Spring AI does as well, they have their own auto-configure jar file. So basically Spring Boot searches for all these auto-configure imports files to make sure that we get a list of configurations which need to be included during the startup and which need to be considered. And of course, they need to be brought into a certain order. So if you look at an auto configuration, and I know now I could win an award for an annotation, sorry. Well, it's not a class I wrote, but it looks like very crazy because there are so many annotations on it. But you can actually see on the top line that it's called @AutoConfiguration, which we know is kind of this @configuration annotation. And there is also that auto-configure before and after annotation in there, right? We know that. And then we have like plenty of other annotations, like conditional annotations. We have @enable annotation, for example. We have @import annotations, and so on. And an auto configuration is basically just like a class which has conditions in there. So where Spring Boot is going to check at startup time, is this condition like true or not? Do these beans need to be created or not, right? It's kind of like a special way of writing ifs, I would say. And if you would build such a thing like now the data source auto configuration, of course it gets like big over time. You have to provide ways for embedded data sources for different databases and so on and so forth. So that's why actually like this configuration looks a little bit more scary. There is quite a lot of conditions out there. As you can see, conditional on class. So it's checking actually like if a class is available in the class path. Conditional on missing class, so it checks for the absence of something. Then you have the same for the on bean and on missing bean. And we have like many other ways as well. So we can check for a specific property, we can check with resource for a specific file, you can evaluate like an expression, you can check for a Java version, you can check if it's like a war deployment, or even if it runs in the cloud, right? So, and there are like many more actually annotations with checks. And you can even build your own one if you want. It's not that difficult. So just to show you like one example you probably all are familiar with, it's actually like the profile annotation. Profile is nothing else than a specific implementation of a conditional annotation, which just checks if a specific profile is actually there. So in the profile condition class, you would actually see that the profile specified is part of the profile selected when your application actually started, right? So you could say like profile is a very specific way of checking, of a condition checking. Fun fact, the @profile was introduced like in Spring Boot and Spring Framework 3.1, so that's quite a while ago, I would say. And then afterwards, when they came up with the approach of conditionals, they rewrote that approach, and now it's following like the same approach with the conditional annotations we have everywhere else. So yes. So you see, if you know a little bit more about it, well, everything actually like is not really magic. And I hope actually like it even gets better throughout the talk. You also know that Spring Boot actually like has many ways of like externalizing configurations. And actually, I realize often that actually Spring Boot developers, maybe younger ones or maybe not so experienced ones who know this, do not understand like fully how actually like Spring Boot goes like through the different buckets in the environment abstraction. And the environment abstraction, which deals with this externalized configuration, actually like contains a lot of buckets with configuration or properties from different sources. And you can actually like imagine that certain information is like more important than others. And I just have a simplified list with like 12 points, but there is actually like way more points actually in there. And even it depends on like other projects you add, like Spring Cloud Config, or if you like add other starters, there might be even like other things which would be added to the list. What I want to say here is basically like the environment abstraction, where we have like the properties, how we can configure Spring Boot, has different ways how configuration can be like provided. And that's, for example, a thing, as you probably know, you might have your configuration in your property files or in YAML files. That's basically like what you see in point 10. Like the old approach, like for the property files with property source, is on point 12. And if you actually like go upper in the list, like if you start from 1, you might have configuration during development which has higher precedence than like the lower configuration. So you could actually imagine that, like, for example, if you provide environment variables, you can override configuration in a property file always. And that's quite helpful, for example, if you think of deploying your application as a container in the cloud, and you have basically like this container image and you cannot change it really, but you can override things from the outside. And by knowing like the different levels where you can apply, for example, properties, that really helps to simplify your configuration. Just like a small thing to add here, imagine as a lazy developer, I'm super happy that I have something like test property source or Spring Boot test where I can basically override for the testing case my properties as well. Because as you can see, it's up in the list, so it has higher precedence over the things in the bottom, right? And when I'm saying I'm a lazy developer, that doesn't mean like I'm crazy. I'm a smart developer, right? I want to do it in a smart way, in a simple way. And basically like duplicating configuration, that really hurts me a lot. So that's why I want to find ways to make it like simpler. And I think this is actually like what we use there all the time. So I would just suggest, have a look at this list, try to debug that part, and if you don't know how to debug this, like approach me afterwards. I'm happy to show you that, because I think it's quite important to understand how this works, because it's so much powerful, even in combination like with other frameworks you would use on top of your Spring Boot application. Great. So one part regarding the properties is also like the configuration properties annotation. And you probably have seen that in the application property file, you might have properties defined and they somehow get mapped to a configuration class or a configuration property class. And I just brought here an example which is not that trivial anymore because it's using a list. Usually, think of like configuring your data source. You only like can configure in Spring Boot like one data source. There is no way actually there to use an array. And in my example, I basically use an example where I create properties and I can assign it to a list. And I can use it like afterwards inside my code. You also see basically the configuration properties annotation uses a prefix. So I can use the prefix and then actually like the field name. So concatenated, that will become the property itself. Actually, configuration properties even support like nested classes, which is actually also quite powerful, right? So this helps me quite a lot actually. These configuration properties, because like everything, and Spring Boot leverages a lot as well, because it's not forcing me to provide like all the properties. I'm just jumping back to the slide because I wanted to highlight that add value basically like forces you to provide a placeholder, like this kind of property definition. If you don't, it fails during startup. Configuration properties is actually like way lazier, way more relaxed, and you might even have a default value there. So thinking of like the way you would use those configuration properties, it's also like the way how you could write the things like in a different way, and that actually like is specific to Spring Boot. And I think it's also like very nice to understand if you have actually like provided a property in a way of writing. Spring Boot basically converts your property in all the 4 different representations. You have like camel case, you have kebab case, which is now kind of the default because it's better readable, and IntelliJ says you should do that, right? You have like the snake case, and you even have like the screaming snake case down there, which looks like an environment variable, right? So Spring Boot during startup uses your property you have defined like in one of these buckets, in one of these property buckets, and will convert it to the other 4 representations. And that means like you do not need to care how you have defined your property and how you read your property. Add value, for example, and others will just like leverage it the way it is. So it's quite nice actually to notice that you're on the safe side, and Spring Boot will for you just do the things the right way. And of course, if you think of testing, there is actually like also a lot of magic going on behind the scenes. Because like if you're starting your Spring Boot test, you are actually also like starting the context of your Spring Boot application. And I'm not saying you should use this annotation like on all your test classes, because like it makes your tests quite slow. But I'm saying here, the magic behind it, if you follow the structure of the packages, it will find the class which is annotated with Spring Boot configuration, and you should only have like one of those. And this is basically like the Spring Boot application class, which is the entry point into your Spring Boot app. So it will find that, and it will start it actually automatically. And you don't need to specify actually where it is. If it cannot find it because you violated the structure, you can of course explicitly configure it if you want to. And then of course, because you're like in a testing environment, you might have like other ways of specifying things there, using, for example, test properties, or maybe even like specifying in what kind of environment you want to run it, if you want to have like the infrastructure mocked or not mocked, or if you want to just like have a command line application and so on. So actually like, yes, Spring Boot does here also like quite a lot behind the scenes. And if you just like dive into that, magic just like dissolves, and you will use it just like a tool because it makes you so much faster. If you look at this Spring Boot test annotation, actually like you see here things like bootstrap with Spring Boot test context bootstrapper. So it's actually a specific way how Spring Boot test actually like starts the testing test context here. And then actually also like we see like the parameters we can actually like provide. So Spring Boot test is nothing else than just like a composed annotation, and it just uses some features which are there, and of course like which will be then used in testing. But as I said before, make sure you do not use Spring Boot test all the time, because you are doing like full integration tests and it makes your test suite quite slow. So unit tests is still like the thing to go, of course, for like many tests, and for certain tests, of course, it's necessary to do so with Spring Boot tests. Another thing which I find quite helpful and quite nice is actually like failure analyzer in Spring Boot, which is also such a feature we just like get used to it, right? And because if you think of like stack traces in Spring, well, you would say we are privileged. The stack traces usually are not that bad. You just go to the root cause during the startup phase. You see like what actually like did not work, and you can fix the issue very easily, right? But there is like easier ways so that you even don't have to look at those stack traces, and it's basically like these failure analyzers. And failure analyzers can basically like detect what's going on and provide you a more helpful feedback, basically like during startup. And I'm sure you have seen something like this before, where you started the same Spring Boot application like multiple times, and basically like it just told you, hey, the port is already in use, right? And you didn't have to check basically like the stack trace, the logs, because there is just this nice message saying, that's the issue. If you change the port or if you stop the other instance, you can actually like run this application in a proper way, right? There is like many failure analyzers, and you could even build your own one if you want to. So you would just like register them like as a Spring Bean, and basically you're done. We also know from Spring Boot, and that's something which is quite helpful, like when you build applications, it's basically like the fetch jars. And you know about that, but fetch jars, when Spring Boot started to use it, was not a new thing. It was there already, and everyone had a proprietary approach to use it, right? And we could even say like there were plugins like OneJar or UberJar, or even the Apache Maven Shade plugin, which like popularized the approach already like 20 years ago. So I'm not saying actually like Spring Boot was copying it, because they did it like slightly different, but be aware of that you might even get like some special errors, which are sometimes hard to do if you use this kind of approach with the fetch jars, because jars in jars, it's not the standard. And I had recently like a case where I used parallel streams in my application. The app was deployed as a fetch jar, and I had a huge issue with the class loader that it was always telling me class not found exception, and I had a look at the classes and it was actually there, right? So Spring Boot actually, if you use fetch jar deployments, they basically like have a different class loader to make actually like Spring Boot aware of the jars in jars. You could say, well, I'm not doing this because I'm using another approach, and typically you should do that, and that's always a good advice to do so. You should actually like explode your fat jar when you are actually doing it in a container. So because of like having an exploded fat jar means like your Spring Boot application starts faster in production, right? And that means like things like, for example, build packs are actually doing that for you. So for example, Paketo build packs create an exploded version. They create layers for the different things, like for your dependencies, for your classes and so on, and they just do it the right way. And you know, there is a command for that, which is basically like the build image goal you can use, and then Spring Boot leverages build packs underneath. And that means like these build packs for Java from Paketo are really like sophisticated, because you can do fancy things, and you have seen it even in the keynote. There is some stuff built in for AOT and training runs. There is like app CDS leveraged, and also, as I said before, the exploded version and many other things. And they also do the layering the proper way. So it's just there, and we just can use it. So it's kind of like the best of the best. Of course, you can also use DevTools, and DevTools you probably have seen as well. Just a dependency you add to your application, and then if a Spring Bean configuration changes, the application context automatically restarts. And DevTools also provide some other features, but I want just like to highlight one which I find fascinating, because you might have like one data issue in production in a Kubernetes environment at the cloud provider, for example, and you would love to debug the application in the cloud, but you can't. DevTools help you with that, because you can connect to your single application instance, which is hopefully not like deployed like in production, because you want to debug that, right? And you can connect via HTTP in debug mode, and you can add breakpoints and debug through your application. So DevTools can help you basically like doing debugging via HTTP, because otherwise you would have to open like TCP ports and so on, and that's quite cumbersome with the cloud providers. It's maybe easier if you have like a private cloud, but that's something which you can easily leverage. Great. And there is actually like one other thing, and this is quite surprising for me, and it's also quite inspiring. It's actually like the community. So if you want to get like the newest news, and you know like the Java ecosystem actually like moved to Blue Sky, I would highly suggest, because Daniel Garnier-Moreau has added a starter pack for the Spring team on Blue Sky. So you get informed by all the people who were working on all these Spring things on Blue Sky, and just scan the QR code, and you will immediately have like the starter pack for all Spring people actually like doing great things, and you will get the newest information there too. So I really can highlight that as well. And of course, in the age of AI, where Stack Overflow is not used so much anymore, I mean, you need to have a way actually like to get in touch with them, right? Might be via GitHub issues, might be via Blue Sky, whatever. There is a way, of course. Great. So just like recap what I have been talking about, and then actually like dive into the last topic. You see auto-configuration and all the other things we have been covering. It's not magic if you know how it works. And if you dive a little bit into it, I would even say like you could leverage it in your application if you like, right? So that leads me actually like to the last topic, which is actually like what I promised in my abstract, to basically like show you how you can actually like do your own starter. And I think that might make sense in several cases, right? So how would you create your own starter for Spring Boot? And actually like why would you? So I can definitely tell you from my own experience that maybe in an enterprise environment, you want to have something defined like custom logging for all the applications. You want to have like security enabled, like for your applications the same way. You want to have like metrics and monitoring enabled, and like other things. And you want to have it like all time the same way. I mean, previously, you might have done libraries and told the others, copy the code of the configuration, integrate it in your app, and these days, you would do your own starter. The starter does not have to be on Start Spring.io. I mean, you just can like add it yourself to your repository and pull it in. That doesn't matter, right? Others are doing the same if you think of certain product vendors. And starters really help you actually like standardize configuration, having reusability of functionality. If you think of version management, that makes it also easier to make sure that in the next build, or if you upgrade like the parent, like the new version get pulled in, like you would do with library, you can have like plugin features. You can use auto configuration to basically like check for certain conditions. And then in the end, it makes life so much easier also for the developers, because they do not need to think of how to do the configuration the right way. So if we go like step by step to create a custom starter, I want to just highlight a few things here. So the first step would be actually like we define our own modules, and be aware of, do not make it the wrong way. So the guideline is basically add your module name in front of Spring Boot AutoConfigure or Spring Boot Starter, just to tell everyone it's not an official thing which is on Start Spring IO, so people will immediately recognize. For the starter itself, if you have like multiple starters on the same thing, like for example Spring AI does, they also added for the module name Spring AI, and then you have like Spring Boot Starter for vector stores. Then you have like this kind of optional postfix if you want to, right? But the module name should be always in front. And just like to tell the others, that's like a custom thing, that's not like from the Spring team, and they do not support that. So the AutoConfigure module itself consists of like a properties class where you would bind the application properties. You would have like the AutoConfiguration class in there. You would have your AutoConfiguration.imports file, and then actually you would also add something which actually helps for auto-completion in your IDE, which is called the Spring Boot Configuration Processor. So that's just like the part of the AutoConfiguration module. So that means like my configuration property looks like this. And be aware of the Java commands here, or the Java doc, because it's used afterwards. It's like what you see in the context menu in your IDE. So basically like that information gets parsed, and it's necessary to tell your fellow developers what is actually like the default value, or like maybe other things what you want to have, right? Then actually, like if you use the Spring Boot configuration processor, there are certain files generated behind the scenes, and that means like you see here this Spring configuration metadata JSON. And the interesting part here is definitely like it provides the IDE, the auto-completion information. So think of having your custom starter not added yet to your application. Auto-completion in your application YAML or application property file would not show up. If you're going to add the starter, it will show up from now on, right? That's actually quite great. If you then actually look at the configuration class or the auto-configuration class, you would actually use auto-configuration, and we remember it's basically like the proxy bean method is set to false, so that's like this performance trick basically, and then we use conditional annotations and the add enable configuration properties to pull in basically like this configuration properties class. And then in there, you're going to specify your Spring Beans, maybe also with some conditionals if you like. And you might even go for a default configuration there too. Great. So this is basically like our configuration class. And you see now, this one is way simpler. By the way, I just did it as an exercise for a library called Java Faker, because sometimes I need like test data. And Java Faker is just a nice tool like to generate test data. You can generate like beers, you can do things in Klingon, you know, if you want to have fun, but you can also generate, for example, places, streets, and so on, which looks like very, very nice as well. So sometimes I have the feeling management doesn't even get it, that the data is just generated, and it's not just test and hello and whatever you do usually like for your test data. Okay. So we have to like specify now these auto configuration imports. That's important. So that's like the entry point for Spring Boot to know about my auto configuration class. That's just a file I add in the specific folder in the meta-inf Spring directory. And I just add that there in a file, basically. Line by line, no separation with comma needed, just line by line for every single auto configuration class, if I have more than one, right? And then in the end, actually, we have a starter module. So the starter module is just something which pulls actually things together. And that means, like, of course, my starter needs the dependency on the auto configuration, but it also needs the dependencies I use, right? So the starter itself should not have logic in there. It's basically just a POM file which just like pulls in the dependencies. And if you would say, I want to flatten basically like my POM, you will actually realize all the starters should be just like POM files, and you could pull in the dependencies like independently, and basically like the starters make things just like easier for you because you tell what kind of dependencies are coming, and because of this transitive approach, this makes it so much easier for the developers, right? But be aware of, don't put any logic in there, because we just don't do it, right, in the Spring ecosystem. And in the end, actually, it's quite simple to add the thing to your application. So that means like adding your dependency, adding your starter, having actually the application, like asking for the Spring Bean, and you can actually like do fun things. Great. So thanks a lot for participating in my session. And if you want to know more about it, my colleagues Fabian Krüger and Moritz Halbritter are doing this afternoon a session on building your own starters. So you will have some possibility for hands-on experience if you like. So attend their session if you want to see more, and if you want to ask difficult questions, of course, as well, right? Thank you very much.